Hello and welcome to episode 48 of the CRM MVP Podcast with me, your host, Daryl, always raising LaBar. In this episode, we're going to look at the top 10 mistakes that CRM developers make. And again, as a disclaimer, these aren't in any particular order, just thought of top of 10, and so we'll go through the order that way. And this is just from my experience. I'm sure there's other mistakes that are just as bad, but these are my top 10. So, without further ado, we'll go with the very first one, and that is not learning TypeScript. There are so many projects that I've been on where TypeScript could be immensely helpful just because of the amount of JavaScript they actually have on the project. And when you have JavaScript and what I found, you have a lot of .NET developers that are on, or that are doing the JavaScript, and it isn't their strong suit. They don't feel as comfortable with it. And when that's the case, people don't feel comfortable changing the actual code. They don't feel comfortable going through and updating things or refactoring things because they're afraid, A, of how it works, and B, they're afraid of breaking it. And so when you use TypeScript, it isn't something magical, but it almost is something magical in that it actually gives you some typing, some assurance, so you can go through and you can actually change things without having to worry that you've completely broken something. So I always recommend that people learn some TypeScript. And the other benefit that you have is it actually is going to give you the best practices and the best ways of doing things now without having to worry about backwards compatibility. So for example, TypeScript allows you to use async and await. That is something that is not supported in IE. So if you want to write something that's supported in all browsers that CRM supports, you can't use await and async. But the TypeScript will actually transpile the code, the JavaScript that it creates. You can specify what version of JavaScript you actually want to use. So when you do that, you can use the latest and greatest versions of things in TypeScript, in your actual coding, in your TypeScript coding for CRM. You can use those at the same time without having to worry about browser support, because you can say, hey, I'm going to compile this for another version of JavaScript, an older version of JavaScript. So that's a huge win in that aspect. And then whenever IE 11 happens to bite the dust and we no longer is supported in CRM, then you can go ahead and change the compile type for TypeScript. And now it will compile in a newer version that doesn't have all the overhead associated with making those things work in a browser that doesn't support them by default. So that's the first thing that I suggest is learn some TypeScript. And if you don't learn TypeScript, you're making a mistake as a developer. There's so much productivity gains to be had in the long run using that. So that's the first one, not learning TypeScript. The second one is not using a tool to deploy web resources. I have gone through many interviews that I've done, and I've interviewed people, and when I get to the point of trying to figure out what kind of developer are they the type of the developer that's going to learn the one thing that they're doing and they're just going to do it forever until the day they die? Or are they the type of developer that's going to go through and say, man, this is horrible. I don't want to be doing this. This is painful. This is something that's not helpful at all to what I'm doing, and it's taking up my time. It's sucking away my life. I'm having to do it all the time, and I like lazy developers. You should be a lazy developer. If you have to do something twice, that's once too many. And so, if you're using the standard out-of-the-box methodology for updating your web resources by going and finding it in a solution and opening up that thing in the dialog within the actual CRM web page and going in and I hope you're not going in and actually editing the HTML or the JavaScript by hand within the editor. I'm hoping you're doing it at least outside of that in some better editor, but maybe even going full Monty and going totally off the end and just doing that in the actual browser window itself. There are so many tools out there to make your life way easier. The one that I use, I still use Visual Studio or VS Code, depending on what project I'm on and the people I'm working with, to edit my JavaScript or edit my TypeScript or edit my HTML. But after that, I don't ever deploy it manually. I use a tool, and I always use the Web Resource Manager in the XRM toolbox. And the advantage that has, mostly because I edited it and put it in there because I wanted to use it, is it has the option in there to go through and to select that you want to deploy your TypeScript files and the mapping files to your CRM instance. So what this does, I think Dave Barry had a podcast on this, 5 years ago or such, where he was talking about having to do code in TypeScript, and the podcaster was saying, how do you debug that stuff? Do you have to debug the JavaScript that it generates? He's like, yeah, it's kind of hard, but you figure it out. And it's like, well, why don't you use mapping files? And then I think Dave went on mute because he had to swear a little bit there. But anyway, it was the web resource manager within the XRM toolbox will allow you to push not only your JavaScript files, but also your TypeScript files and mapping files. This then allows you to debug all those TypeScript code in TypeScript and not having to worry about the generated code in JavaScript. TypeScript does a decent job of going through and creating the code and honoring the code that you wrote in TypeScript and JavaScript. It does a fairly good job at that, but it's not perfect. And it's not, and it does things that TypeScript doesn't. TypeScript does things in JavaScript that it isn't allowed, or it does in TypeScript. There we go. That it isn't allowed in JavaScript, and so it has to take generate some extra code in order to handle that, which is great because I don't have to write that. I mean, I still don't know how to go through and actually define a class in JavaScript. I've had multiple people that have ran into me and just assumed that I'm a JavaScript expert, or I'm a front-end expert, and I don't think I'm an expert by any means. But the beauty of TypeScript is that it obfuscates all that for me, and I just say, hey, I want this, and it defines how to do it in JavaScript. So, again, I'm back on number one, but the number 1 and 2 are closely defined in that they're both editing and dealing with web resources. So, and number 2 is not using a tool to deploy the web resources. I can also add to that there is a tool for Visual Studio, a third-party plugin to add in that. There's Sparkle XRM has some options for doing that. There's a whole slew of tools. I've run into many companies that created their own tool for doing that. You can even create some solution and just put your JavaScript files in there and upload it as a solution. And there's 500 different ways to do it. But if you're going in your dev environment and pasting in your code in the actual web resource editor within CRM, you're doing it wrong. Number 3. Not using early binding, and this is one where I'll get some slack from Jonas and some other developers out there as well. But I think it's a mistake to not use early binding where you can. There are some instances where you truly can't use early binding because you're maybe dealing with a plugin that potentially is going to create something that is going to operate against multiple entities, and so there really isn't a way to do that. But a majority of the time, you can go through and define those early bind types and use those types. And if you're not doing that, you're just losing out on so much productivity developer-wise. You're losing out on the early binding that it saves you. You're losing out on any time that you happen to enter a text value incorrectly for the name of a attribute. And I have to laugh because Jonas created the late bound entity generator, which generates all those file names, or those constant strings for those attributes. So if you're going to go to the pain of going through and generating that, why don't just generate the early bind? It's the same amount of pain, same exact amount of pain. You just click a button and you wait the 10 to 50 seconds, whatever it happens to be, depending on your internet connection and your computer processor, and you're done. And then you go about the rest of your day or the week or whatever it happens to be. So not only is it the early binding that you get for not messing up on the naming, but the other important thing, and this is a huge thing just for readability purposes, is having it being typed to the actual value that it actually is. Having to call the get attribute value and then specifying the type every single time you're getting an attribute using the late bound approach, it's very painful. It's hard to read. As a developer, you are reading your code far, far more often than you're ever writing your code. Because you're going to read it the day you write it. You're going to read it 3 times that single time you wrote that line because you're probably going to change it here or there or something else. I mean, you're always going to be reading it way more than you're going to be writing it. And so when your brain has to go look at those pixels, and it has those text strings to look at for your line that you wrote for getting a value, if it's twice as long because it has to add this try get value and it has to cast to a particular type before you can actually access the actual value, it's more work for your brain, and it's harder for you to read. It's harder for you to go through and debug, because now it's going to cause you to have to debug a lot more because you're going to have instances where you get the wrong type. And so there's so much productivity gains you get from it that it's far outweighs any productivity losses you get from the actual generating the entities. And with tools like the early bound generator, it's so simple to go through and do that and specify just the entities you want, because you can keep that list smaller. It's even faster to generate, and it's even smaller, a smaller payload in your plugin. Now, with this back in the day, I guess this is maybe a point too, is sometimes people go through and generate all their entities. That's maybe not the best practice, and I'll give you two reasons. One's because it's a lot slower to generate all of them rather than just one of them. But the main reason is that the plugin size in CRM Online, it's actually limited. And if you generate every single entity that exists now in the latest version, you're coming very close to the max size of your plugin can be. So that's just an ancillary to that, is you need to be careful to only generate what you need. There's no reason to generate more. If you need to generate more, you can generate it later. You also don't need to worry about generating it every single time you add an attribute. Oh, so-and-so added an attribute to this entity. Now it's going to break my early binding. No, it doesn't break it. Just the same way as you wouldn't have to edit your code if someone added an attribute that was late bound. The same thing for early bound. The only time you have to go through and edit it is if someone deletes an attribute, which hardly ever happens, or if someone creates an attribute that you actually need. That's the only time you have to go through and regenerate things. So you can go months or maybe even a year with some things, or longer, just depending on what you're dealing with. If you're dealing with just out-of-the-box fields, an out-of-the-box entity, on some plugin that you're going to create once and not touch for the next 4 years, it'll run perfectly fine with those early bindings being out of date, as long as it doesn't touch anything that doesn't exist. So that's number 3, not using the early binding. Number 4, not using a plugin base. This is one that I'm amazed on the number of projects that I've gone on that people aren't using a plugin base. They aren't going through and attempting to take code that's normally very, very wet, very not dry, and trying to make it dry. And that's the first step, is to go in and to create that plugin base, to handle your logging, to handle all of the things that you need to do in every single plugin. Every single plugin needs to handle error exceptions. Every single one. Why in the world do you copy and paste code everywhere? Why don't you have a plugin base that does it for you? Every single code should log things to the database that needs to log. So if you have an error, you should be able to log all the context in the plugin. That way you have some information about what came in, what went out, what happened. And so why don't you set that up in the plugin base? Or even more particularly, and this is actually number 5 here, the execution context. So many people try to take the plugin base and they try to do everything, make everything work by just creating a plugin base. And they don't do anything with the execution context. And this causes some issues because there are things that are in the execution context that are thread safe, that are not thread safe. There you go. You have to be careful that you don't share those amongst your other calls to your plugin. And so by default, when CRM creates a plugin, it creates one instance of it, and it goes through and calls that plugin multiple times. And so the very simple mistake you see is that you see developers that are new taking that execution context and getting an iOrganization service out of it and storing it in a property on the plugin. No. If you do that, you're creating a race condition where if more than one person calls that plugin at the same exact time, you can have instances where the plugin is running and then the thread pauses, the other thread picks up, it updates that plugin property, and then it resumes, and then the other one that was paused resumes, and now its service that it had that was once related to the user that actually called it is now related to the user on the other thread that called it. So that's actually an instance, number 5 here, where you want to use a custom execution context. So not creating a custom execution context, definitely a bad thing to do. So creating a custom execution context is something that is fairly simple. You want to implement the interfaces that you actually want to implement multiple interfaces. So not only do you want to implement the iService provider so you can still use it to get things out of it if you need to, you also want to implement the iPlugin execution context so you don't have to go and grab that out of the service provider each and every time you need it, as well as being able to implement the iTrace service. So if you go through and you add all those services to your context that you're creating that's custom, you don't need to grab those things out of your context in your execute method and then pass it into all your methods. You can just pass in your context to all your methods. And now it's going to go through and it's going to populate those things correctly, and it's going to not have to pull those out each time. And you've only got one variable to pass into all of your actual methods. So definitely. Not creating a custom execution context, no, don't do that. It's bad. Bad things. Number 6, not creating unit tests. This is probably no surprise to most people that know me, but create unit tests. People think it's way too hard, and there's no excuses now in the CRM world to do that. Originally, before we had my XRM unit test framework or Jordy's and the community's XRM fake XRM framework, writing unit tests for CRM was rather difficult. The prioritization service is not the most easy thing in the world to mock out. And even then, when you do mock it out, it's still not testing your actual code. And so not only are you not getting your actual unit test benefits from being able to go through and make changes and see how the code and logic has changed over time, you're also having to actually have a longer development lifecycle, because now every single time you make a change, you've got to deploy it to a version of CRM in order to actually go through and test it. So even today I had a question of, Daryl, how do you deploy your plugins to CRM? And they were utilizing the Visual Studio extension from the CRM SDK providers. That isn't so they were using an old version of Visual Studio that supports it, and that's what they were doing to do that. But in my case, I'm still using the plugin registration tool because I don't honestly use it that much. Because I write my unit tests, I wait until they pass. Once they pass locally, then I configure my unit tests to actually run against the real live version of CRM. I catch any potential issues that there may be between my local in-memory CRM and a real live version of CRM. And then after that point, I go and deploy my plugin. Now, probably 95 times out of 100, I will go through and just make a quick sanity check to see if I have any issues, and I don't have any issues, and I never have to touch the plugin again or deploy it again. But if your work cycle is you make a change, you build the change, you deploy your change, and then you go out and you test your change, yeah, obviously then, totally. I've never even gotten to the point to using the plugin, the XRM Toolbox plugin to automatically deploy. I need to probably do that in my next project just to see how that works. But so far, it hasn't been something that is a pain point in my development cycle, because I use unit tests. Unit tests are also the best documentation you can ever ask for, because not only is it going to tell any future developers what you currently, in your current point in time, are expecting that code to do, when it does need to change, you get a date within the actual source control of when that logic changed. So now if you go, at one point in time, the plugins used to work this way, but now they don't. When did we make that change? And what did it do, what did it not used to do? You should be able to go back to your unit test and look at your unit test and see when they changed and go, last release we went through and we changed it from doing this thing to doing that thing. And it's not any extra code you ever need to write besides your unit test, which you should be writing anyway. So, so if you're not writing unit tests, if you're not using those frameworks that exist out there for making your life easier, you're doing it wrong. Write those unit tests. Number 7, not logging plugin context on errors. So I mentioned this a little earlier here, but if you have an error in your plugin, by default, you don't get much information in the trace logs for the actual plugin execution. You get the entity that it occurred, you get the the stage it occurred on, and if it's synchronous, asynchronous, and that's about all you get. You don't get any information on the actual target. So if you're dealing with a create or update, you don't get any information as far as what was in the target. What were the attributes that were present? You don't get any information about what it was when the exception was thrown. So if you're not doing that, then you're losing out on how to be able to debug your plugin. So your only option then is to, assuming that you're not writing a unit test, is to go through and actually use the plugin registration tool to set up your actual test case that's failing in CRM, and then firing the event to hook into that through the plugin registration tool to debug it, and then debugging it. That whole process takes a good 2 minutes to set up, 2 minutes to configure, 2 minutes to get to the point where you can actually debug. And that's assuming that you know what type of data is actually causing the problem. So that becomes very, very painful. But if you go through and in your error handling, you go through and just walk through the actual plugin execution context. I know Jonas has a library for it. My DLB.XRM library does it as well. There's probably a whole slew of libraries that go through and do it. Just walks through and spits out what's in the target. And it is so immensely helpful for debugging things. You can go through and say, I had an error. I had a null ref. Why did I have that issue? You can look at the target and see what values that were passed in were null. And then you can go through and double check that in the plugin and say, oh yeah, I didn't populate this value. So that's such an easy thing to do. I mean, theoretically, as long as you're using a plugin base, it's adding a few lines of code to actually call the logic, assuming that you're probably using the logic that actually walks the whole structure. So either Jonas's library, my library, you can use that in your plugins and just call the code and say, hey, trace everything out, and then you're done. So why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you get that extra information so you can go through and debug it? And then if you're using unit test, you can actually take that and write a unit test based on that data and be testing your plugin within about the same amount of time. Probably takes the same amount of time to set up a unit test with that data as it does to set up the plugin registration tool to actually execute that. And now you've got a unit test that you can save and maintain going forward because, hey, it failed already in some environment, so you probably should have a unit test to catch yourself from doing that again. So that's number 7, not logging plugin context on errors. Number 8, looking up preimages by name. So here's something that is so simple, I can't believe I didn't think of it myself, and I need to thank the actual person that brought it up. I've lost it to the internets at this point in time, but I remember having I think it was a Stack Overflow question, and someone was asking how to get a preimage out of the context, and I gave my response, and someone else commented that, I never actually access the preimage and the post images by name. So normally it's context that got preimd images, and then you have to pass in, it's a dictionary, so you pass in the actual name of the actual preimage, and you get the image back, and that's what I always used to do. And then I always registered all my plugins the same way, so I wouldn't ever have to worry about having the key actually not being in the dictionary there for that image. But sooner or later, I capitalized something wrong, typed something wrong, and I'd get an error, and the key not found in the dictionary, and go back and, I registered my plugin wrong. I have to go through and update my plugin. So I don't know how often that happens, once a month, maybe a little more, maybe a little bit less, depends how many I'm writing, but there's no reason to do that. Simple solution is just to actually access the dictionary and grab the very first value out of the dictionary. I've never, ever seen a case where anybody has registered more than one image, either pre-image or more than one post-image. I've seen both a pre-image and a post-image on one registration. But I've never seen a plugin registration that registered more than one pre-image or more than one post-image. And I can't think of any instance where you'd actually want to register more than one pre-image or more than one post-image. Whenever you register a pre-image or a post-image, it's going to require a SQL query to CRM to go and actually get that data. So I don't know why you'd want to separate up those images into different values. And even if you did, it's pretty easy to write an overload that accepts a string if you do want to give that value. But by default, just write an extension method that says, get me the pre-image, that goes and takes in that plugin context and goes and just looks up the very first pre-image and returns it. It's like 6 lines of code, and it saves you from ever registering your plugin and putting in a name that doesn't match the name that's in the actual plugin itself. So it's just an extremely simple thing to do that I see all the time, that I don't see anybody go through and use this best practice of actually just grabbing the very first image out of the collection. So it's number 8. Number 9, putting all your plugin logic in a single execute method. I wish there was a methodology in which you could reach out and punish the developer that wrote a piece of code that you have to maintain. And actually, sometimes I don't, because I write stuff that I'd punish myself at later. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a good thing. But there are so many times when I'm having to go through and debug a plugin, or go in and understand what is a plugin doing. And I open up the plugin class, and I'm greeted by 500 plus lines that all exist in a single execute method of the plugin. This is bad on so many levels. Number one, it's almost completely unmaintainable. You don't know what's going on, where it's at. You change something, very, very, very likely you're going to create a bug. It's going to be highly nested more than likely, because we're going to have other statements, if statements and stuff in there, and so it's going to be hard to keep track of what is the logic intending to do, why is it doing it, and it's going to cause the code to be very, very difficult to maintain. You won't be able to actually unit test any different parts of it. You have to unit test the thing as a whole, which makes it even harder to unit test. So, putting all that code in that single method is a pain on so many fronts. And the solution for it is very simple. Just extract out a method. Visual Studio has it built in. Select it, extract it out. If you're using ReSharper, extract it out. There's so many tools that go through and do this because it's something you need to do. It's something that needs to happen by default. And so go through and take your plugin method, extract it out into separate methods within that class, or extract it out to maybe a separate class that does all that kind of stuff. It's such an easy thing to do, and could save you hours of work potentially, because it's going to save these bugs. I was on a project where we were editing 200. I think there was 260 plugins that we had to update. Mammoth amount of plugins. And I was getting an all reference one of them, and so I opened it up the plugin, and I'm looking at it, and it made 37 different calls to CRM in that single method. 37 different ones. And one of the calls was causing a null ref exception, and it was getting populated wrong and was causing a null ref. I had no idea. The only way in which I could figure out where it was with any sense of being remotely proficient was just to go through, start refactoring the method, splitting it up into 20 or 30 or maybe 40 different sub-methods, and in the process understanding what the heck it is doing. Because if you're trying to read 500 lines to figure out what's going on, it's not going to happen. It's kind of like if you have a book. So I guess this is maybe for non-developers. So if you have a book and it has one chapter, the chapter of the book begins with in the beginning. That's the first chapter, and that's the only chapter in the book. You have no idea what that book's about. You have to read half of it, all of it, a quarter of it, 100 pages to have any idea what it's about and what's going to happen. Where if you have a book that has 50, 100 chapters, and each one has a name that's well named what's going on in that chapter, you can peruse through it and get a pretty good idea of what the book's about. You don't even have to dive into the chapters. If the more specific that chapter is, you don't have to even go into the chapter, even read the chapter to see what it is. You could read just the chapter titles and get a fairly decent idea of what's going on. And that same sort of logic applies when it comes to plugin and comes into any sort of development. The smaller your plugin methods, the smaller your methods, whether plugin or not plugin, are, the simpler and easier it is to figure out what's going on, figure out what needs to change, and keep yourself from breaking things and to keep things dry. There are so many advantages to doing that, and that's if I had to order these things as far as the number one thing to do, that this is the number one thing to focus on, that may be that. That may be it, is just not putting all of your code in a single execute method on that plugin. Just doesn't make any sense at all. That's number 9. Number 10, not using extension methods to keep code dry and discoverable. This is something that's been around in .NET for years. Since I think .NET 2, I think they added extension methods. And when they came out, there was a cry from the established development community of, no, don't do that. That's bad. That's just it's bad to do that, and I never really understood why, and I still don't understand why. I guess there are ways you can abuse things, but it's so helpful in so many ways. When you have to know some weird helper class, so my helper dot get whatever, if you have a helper class that you create, not only do you have to, as a new developer, have to know what that helper class name is, you also have to go through all the different methods trying to figure out what object you're trying to act on. Because it's my helper dot whatever the method name is, and you could have 4 or 5 methods with the same name. You could have 100 methods that operate on 10 different types. But it becomes very, very not discoverable friendly doing that. Where extension methods, they remove so many of those problems. So the only thing you need in an extension method, the only thing you need is that you need a static class and a namespace. The only thing you need to use it is the actual namespace. So you add the namespace, and now you get all full IntelliSense as far as what are all these methods that you can do against the object for which you want to operate against. So I see CRM helper methods that get all records. Okay, that goes through and it will go through and do a query and handle paging for you, all that kind of stuff. But it's operating on the iOrganization service. That method really belongs on the iOrganizational service. But because you don't have rights to that extension, you don't have rights to that interface, you can't edit the interface to say, hey, this is a new method that should exist. But you can write an extension method against it. So now in the code, rather than typing my common code dot, what was the name of that method? There's 500 methods to look at. It could just be service dot, okay, there's 15 methods here. Okay, this is the method I want because it's going to be specific to just the extension methods and the default methods that exist on that type. Another example that I've seen for these extension methods is you can use them in cases where normally early binding isn't possible. So what I mean by that, let's say you are going through and you've got the same attribute that exists on multiple entities. Okay, so you can create an interface. You can go through and declare that those entities implement those interfaces because they have those attributes on them. And then you can create an extension method against those interfaces that operates on those attributes. And now you've got all that code in one spot, and you don't have to have it duplicated for each and every entity that you have to deal with. And the next time you bring a new entity on that you want to implement the same interface, you just implement the interface and you're done. You don't have to go through and rewrite the logic for how to implement whatever that functionality is. So probably the simplest example for this is to get a friendly, readable address, right? There's 8 or 10 CRM entities out of the box that have address line 1, address line 2, and city, state, zip, all that kind of fun stuff. Create an interface that's entity addressable, or whatever you want to call it. Come up with a better name. Create that interface. Go through and create classes that are actually files for those early bound entities, because I'll back up a little bit here. With early bound entities, it generates all the classes as partial classes. And many developers don't have any idea what a partial class is unless they spent time in WinForms, and then they probably have a pretty good idea what a partial class is. But a partial class is just a way of saying this file and this file are going to create the same class. And so that way you can have one file for your class that is created via the whatever auto generation tool you want to use, CRM early bound generator or whatever. And then you've got another file that doesn't get touched by that, and it has whatever custom changes in it that you want. So you put all that information in you want. So you say, hey, this contact class implements the iAddressable interface. Okay, and you do another one for the account, another one for whatever, and you can add in whatever custom methods you want to add. You can go ahead and add those, and you don't ever have to worry about the early bound generation overriding. And it's simple to go through and do all that stuff, right? And then it never gets touched by the auto generation. And then in your interface, you can add an extension method. I even put it in the same class, and some people may argue with that on me, but if I create an interface, iAddressable, and it contains the 6 or 7 address fields that you need, address line 1, city, state, zip, so forth, and I want to go through and define an extension method for that allows me to be able to get an address as a string that contains all those fields together in a correct formatting, I'll just create an extension class in the same file as that interface and put my method in there, because it's the same thing. They belong together. And it's not like I'm going to go through and create 5,000 extension methods on the interface, but I'm going to have 4 or 5 or 6 maybe, and it just makes so much more sense when I'm going to go find that thing. I know that thing's against the interface, and I can go to the interface and go find the actual methods fairly quickly and see, oh, these are all the methods that are in there, and have one place to look at and one place to organize things. So using those extension methods are an incredible tool in our tool belt as developers to go through and make code dry and discoverable. If for some reason you don't want to access that extension method as an extension method against an actual object, you can still call it the static way. You just have to know what the name of your static extension class is, but you can still call it the other way as well. But it just makes it so much easier when you're dealing with the objects. And another fun thing on extension methods is they are the only methods that work on null objects. Meaning that I can have a value that is null and call an extension method on that null object. Normally you'll get an object.null exception. But you can write an extension method for it, and again, don't abuse this, but you can write an extension method for it that goes and checks to see if it does have a value, and if it doesn't have a value, then just return. If it does, then do whatever logic you actually need to do. So extension methods are really, really powerful along those lines as well. So there we have it. There's the top 10 list of mistakes that CRM developers make: not learning TypeScript, not using a tool to deploy web resources and always doing it manually, not using the early binding options that are available in CRM. I will have lots of people argue against me in that, but I will argue for that till the day I die, and I will tell them to come join the dark side of early binding. Not using a plugin base. I just did a seminar actually on that for CRM UG, and walk through the whole DLB XRM plugin based stuff, and that's actually the new tool in the XRM toolbox that I created. The Visual Studio Solution Accelerator is designed to help you bring in all the code required for having a plugin base that you can use in all your plugins without having to IO merge it later. So you can use shared projects within CRM to do that. Or within Visual Studio, you can use shared projects to do that. That's number 4, not using a plugin base. Number 5, not creating a custom execution context. Number 6, not creating unit tests. Come on, create your unit tests. You know you want to. Number 7, not logging plugin context on errors. Number 8, looking up those preimages by name. I was actually at CMUG. I mentioned that in one of my presentations, and Andrew Batinko he was like blown away. I was like, why didn't I ever think of that before? So that's what I see all the time, even from MVPs. Number 9, putting all your plugin logic in a single execute method. And I guess I can go for any method, but that one I see is most common. And number 10, not using extension methods to help keep your code dry and discoverable. So those are Daryl's top 10 things not to do. Thanks for listening to this episode of the CRM MVP Podcast. As always, you can follow us on Twitter at CRM MVP Podcast for news regarding new episodes and to suggest topics or guests for future episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the rest of our episodes at crmmvppodcast.com.